Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're looking at a flight that ended in a terrifying crash, and somehow it turned into one of the most incredible survival stories in aviation history.
Picture this, August 2nd, 2005. A massive passenger jet with hundreds of people on board tries to land in a violent storm. It skids right off the end of the runway, plunges into a ravine, and then just erupts into this massive fireball.
309. Just let that sink in. That's how many people were on that Airbus A340. 309 souls, suddenly trapped inside a burning, broken wreck.
And this is the number of people who died. 0. Not a single one. So the question is, how on earth is that possible? And what led them to crash in the first place?
All right, to really get what happened here, we got to rewind the clock and go back to the start of that day for Air France Flight 358.
So it all starts out as a totally normal, routine 8-hour flight across the Atlantic. The plan was for the co-pilot, Frederick Naud, to handle the landing in Toronto. Just to get some more experience under his belt. But here's the thing. As they got closer to Canada, the situation on the ground was changing, and fast. It was becoming anything but routine. So the crew in the cockpit, they're getting these regular weather updates. But the storm over Toronto Pearson Airport, it was getting nasty. We're talking heavy rain, crazy lightning, and really unpredictable winds. It got so bad the airport actually declared a red alert, which meant all the ground crews had to run for cover.
Now, even with all this going on, and with other pilots warning that the runways were super slick, air traffic control clears them to land. And this is a huge deal. They tell them to use runway 24L, which just happens to be the shortest runway at the entire airport.
So you can imagine what it was like inside the cabin. People were getting really nervous. They could literally feel the pilots fighting the plane, wrestling with the controls just to keep it lined up with the runway, while the sky is just exploding with lightning all around them.
Okay, so it's just after 4 p.m. The plane comes roaring in for the landing. The touchdown, it's way, way harder than anything the passengers had ever felt before.
For just a second, there's this wave of relief. People even start clapping. But that feeling vanished in an instant. The plane starts bouncing violently, skidding out of control. It was still moving at 146 kilometers an hour when it just ran out of runway. It plummets into a 50-foot ravine and literally breaks apart on impact.
And then, things go from bad to worse. Fire erupts, and the smell of jet fuel just fills the cabin. Everyone knew what that meant. This whole thing could explode at any moment.
Okay, this number is so important. 90 seconds. That's the international safety standard. It's the maximum amount of time it's supposed to take to get every single person off a plane in an emergency, no matter how big it is.
And what happened next was just incredible. The crew, in this moment of pure chaos, was absolutely heroic. They get half the emergency exits open, some of them opening right into smoke and flames. Passengers are literally jumping and sliding for their lives. And get this, the first emergency responders are on the scene in an unbelievable 52 seconds. Every single one of the 309 people on board got out. They hit that 90-second mark just moments before the fuel tanks went up, and the plane was completely destroyed in a massive fireball.
So, the evacuation? Absolutely a miracle. But the crash itself? That should never, ever have happened. And investigators from Canada's Transportation Safety Board had to figure out exactly why it did. And what they found was that it wasn't just one mistake. It was a whole chain of them, a cascade of errors that sealed the plane's fate. The pilots chose to land in a monster storm. They touched down almost halfway down the runway. And then, this is the real kicker, they didn't hit the reverse thrusters for a full 17 seconds. Now, reverse thrusters are basically the engine's brakes. They're absolutely essential for slowing down a huge jet, especially on a wet runway. It's believed that in the chaos of that landing with the violent crosswinds, the pilots got this kind of tunnel vision. They were so focused on just keeping the plane straight that they missed that critical step until it was way, way too late. And this table here, it just lays it all out perfectly. The margin for error was paper thin. You have the major pilot errors, landing long, delaying the thrusters, but then you pile the conditions on top of that. They were dealing with a massive 33-knot crosswind, which is wind blasting the side of the plane, making it super hard to control. And they were doing all this on the airport's shortest runway. There was just no room left for any mistakes.
But, the investigation didn't just point fingers at the pilots. It actually uncovered a much bigger, system-wide problem in aviation safety, something that went way beyond this one flight.
See, the crash of Air France 358, that's what's known as a classic runway overrun. It's actually one of the most common types of accidents in aviation. So this wasn't some kind of freak, one-in-a-million event, it's a problem the whole industry has been dealing with.
And a huge reason why this overrun turned into a full-blown catastrophe was the lack of a proper safety area at the end of that runway. I mean, international guidelines say you should have a 300-meter buffer zone, right? A clear area. Well, runway 24L had just 60 meters before a 50-foot drop into a ravine.
And this is the part that will give you chills. This wasn't some unknown danger. There was a fatal crash in that exact same ravine 27 years earlier. An official investigation recommended that the gully should be filled in to make sure it never happened again. And that recommendation? It was just ignored. It's a really chilling example of how known risks sometimes get pushed aside until another disaster forces the issue. But here's the thing. A solution for this exact problem already existed. It's called an EMAS, or Engineered Material Arresting System. Basically, think of it like one of those gravel escape ramps you see for runaway trucks on a highway. It's a bed of special crushable concrete at the end of a runway that's designed to safely stop a plane if it overshoots. But back then, Toronto's airport didn't have one. A lot of major airports didn't.
So when you look at the whole picture, the story of Air France 358 is really two things at once. On one hand, it's an incredible celebration of a heroic flight crew whose training and courage saved 309 lives. But it's also a serious wake-up call. It shows just how thin the line between a miracle and a total catastrophe can be. And it leaves us with a really tough question to think about. Are we actually learning from these close calls, or are we just waiting for the next tragedy to force us to implement the safety solutions we already know about?